You guys good? All three of my judges?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Anush. I'll start. Second round, you said that. All right. Everyone good? I'll start time now. Acton-Boxborough affirms, our first and only point of contention is ending the conflict in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is currently engaged in a drawn-out war in Yemen. Worth of the New York Times explains, Saudi Arabia first began its bombing campaign in Yemen 3 years ago, hoping for a quick victory. Instead, the war became a stalemate, leading to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The blood is on the Saudis' hands. BBC writes that well over half of the 60,000 civilians killed in direct conflict were killed by airstrikes. But perhaps the more striking feature of the Saudi war effort is its focus on economic and humanitarian targets rather than military threats. Walsh of the New York Times reports that Saudi Arabia has led a raft of harsh economic measures against Yemen, signaling that it is willing to starve to death an entire nation of innocent civilians just to weed out a few thousand of its opponents. This is primarily through airstrikes. Byman of Brookings explains that while the United Arab Emirates has taken the lead on fighting Yemen's ground war, Saudi Arabia is responsible for the majority of airstrikes in Yemen. However, Mundy of Tufts University finds that since 2015, Saudi airstrikes have shifted from military to primarily civilian targets, including agriculture, infrastructure, and hospitals. In fact, a study from the London School of Economics in 2017 found that agriculture targets were the most common hit in airstrikes. These strikes destroy Yemeni lives, as 60% of Yemeni households rely on the agricultural sector as a main source of income. As such, Mundy finds that the Saudi strategy has transformed into one choking off key agricultural centers in the hopes of starving citizens to death. That's why Summers of The Guardian finds that airstrikes alone forced Yemen into the worst famine in a century. Indeed, Oxfam finds that Saudi's military measures have doubled the price of transportation, fuel, and food, while the average Yemeni income has plummeted. That's why they find that 8.4 million Yemenis are at a high risk of starvation. There's no easy solution to the conflict. However, ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia is the best way forward, and this is true for 3 reasons. The first is ending military capabilities. Hartung of The Guardian explains that because Saudi Arabia is locked into U.S. weapon systems, it would take decades for them to switch to another arms seller. Moreover, Guai of Penn State University explicates that the high cost of such a switch would be difficult for even the oil-rich Saudi Arabia, which is why Meyer of NPR finds that ending arms sales would ground Saudi airstrike capabilities immediately. Similarly, Cordesman of the CSIS posits that Saudi Navy, due to its inexperience, is entirely dependent on American support and cooperation. Furthermore, U.S. actions foster international responses. Nowak of The Independent writes that if the United States were to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, other allies like Britain would follow, which is why Rydell of Brookings finds that because of the high maintenance of both the Navy and Air Force, ending U.S. arms sales would be the best way to reduce Saudi intervention. The second is reforming Saudi behavior. Davis of the New York Times explains in December, Congress wants to send a message against Saudi Arabia's behavior in Yemen. Since Saudi Arabia is completely dependent on the U.S. for arms, ending sales would force the nation to acquiesce. The Human Rights Watch contextualizes that cutting off arms sales would signal to the Saudi government that the U.S. is not going to reward Saudi Arabian behavior with weapons. That's why Caverly of the New York Times concludes that the best way to change Saudi policy is to cut them off our arms. Third, and finally, is increasing the cost of war. Because Saudi Arabia can currently engage in Yemen through airstrikes and blockades without expanding human capital, Bozzi of The Atlantic explains that it has little incentive to engage in peace talks. However, without their weapons, war would seem like a less appealing option to the Saudi Arabians. As a result, Bozzi concludes that if the U.S. stopped its arms sales, Saudi Arabia would be more likely to make peace at the negotiation table. That's what we've found.
Just before we read the case, can I see the allies with policy?
But wait, what?
The part, I don't know if that our allies would follow suit.
Yeah, sure. I have it.
Ben and I negate. Our sole contention is the price of peace. According to Rogan and the McLaughlin Group, as Saudi Arabia's largest military supplier, the U.S. has significant leverage over the kingdom, which it has been using to reduce the human costs of the war in Yemen. Stopping arms sales and ending America's influence over Saudi policy will cause a humanitarian catastrophe in two ways. First, by tightening the blockade. According to Human Rights Watch, at the start of the war, Saudi Arabia initiated a naval blockade against Yemen, limiting the delivery of humanitarian aid, including food, fuel, and medicine. In November, the coalition tightened the blockade, closing Yemen's main airport and preventing almost all aid deliveries. The blockade devastated the Yemeni people, as Reuters reports that 22 million Yemenis rely on aid to survive, and because of the stringent blockade, aid deliveries dropped by 84%, causing 2.5 million people to be cut off from clean water, and an additional 12 million people to become malnourished. Fortunately, according to Rose and Politico, this series of events prompted swift U.S. action, as U.S. State Department and White House issued 4 statements demanding Saudi Arabia end its blockade, and privately threatened to recall U.S. support for the war. According to AFP, the Saudis gave in, as just days later, they ended their blockade, allowing aid shipments to stream into Yemen for the first time in months. As a result, Yemenis have regained access to basic necessities, with the UN reporting that because the blockade has been lifted, aid has reached twice as many people. Unfortunately, Rogan finds that an end to U.S. arms sales could jeopardize this vital progress, as it would undermine the U.S.'s ability to influence Saudi policy, and would likely result in a renewed effort to starve Yemen into submission. Second, by ending the ceasefire. According to BBC, last summer, the Saudis attacked Hodeidah, the largest port city in Yemen, but were quickly pressured by the U.S. to halt their offensive and participate in peace talks. According to Winter of The Guardian, by December, a landmark ceasefire over the city was agreed to, almost entirely due to U.S. influence. The ceasefire has largely held. As BBC reported over the last few weeks, hospitals are treating 75% fewer injured persons, and the UN has certified that there have been no major offensives from either side. According to the Washington Institute, Saudi airstrikes have been scaled back as well, occurring 95% less frequently than before. All this progress could be reversed, however, without U.S. pressure to continue the armistice. Rogan concurs, writing that ending arms sales would encourage Saudi Arabia to reject the ceasefire and recommence fighting in Hodeidah, as the U.S. would no longer have the bargaining chip of military support to restrain Saudi aggression. This would devastate the Yemeni people in 3 ways. First, by disrupting aid. According to Reuters, 80% of humanitarian aid goes through Hodeidah's port. Luckily, according to Lee of The Guardian, the ceasefire created a UN humanitarian corridor in the city, allowing aid to be delivered without interference for the first time in 6 months. Winter reports that the World Food Program alone has enough aid stored in Hodeidah to feed 4 million people, and has only now been able to distribute it as the ceasefire takes hold in Sydney. However, the Brookings Institute reports that if the assault on Hodeidah resumed, 14 million would be pushed into famine because of disruptions in the aid supply. Prior to the ceasefire, when the Saudis launched small-scale attacks on Hodeidah, McKernan reports that deliveries through the port were cut in half, as the price of food rose 21% and 3.2 million became malnourished. Second, by worsening violence. When the Saudis launched strikes on Hodeidah last summer, McKernan reports that civilian casualties rose 164%. According to Larson of the U Chicago, if the fighting resumed in Hodeidah alone, it would cause 250,000 deaths, eclipsing the total fatalities of the war 25 times over. Third, by undermining the peace process. According to Hall of the Independent, the Hodeidah ceasefire is the foundation of ongoing peace talks that aim to end the conflict diplomatically. Yet, according to the IRIN, if the major Hodeidah ceasefire collapsed, all progress towards peace would be undone, as the Saudis and rebels blame one another for the renewed hostilities and view all future diplomacy with suspicion, an attitude that will only serve to prolong the miseries of war. Thus, we negate.
Can we see the last part that you read and also the blockade was lifted?
Wait, first, which part?
The IRIN.
The last one.
Sure. The no future peace.
Yeah. They made like major progress.
Okay, the first one, the one with
Yeah. Well, no, I just want the one that says major progress.
not the IRN.
That was the
I
same
don't know
part.
what that is. Wait, would you just tell me like what do you want it to say?
It was in your third impact. You said there was major progress made. Didn't you say that?
It says the foundation of like peace talks.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's right there.
This is like, it's the foundation of
Okay. Starting now. Where's the date? Out here. Okay. All right. Next one.
4 seconds. What else?
The
Port.
the end, the blockade ended.
Yeah.
Can we see the
Date.
Oh,
Date on the
it's
end.
Okay.
Wait, what? Can I see the date?
The date, it's a 2018
Okay.
press release, it's talking about blockade, and it's on YouTube.
That's 6 seconds. Yeah, 1 second. Let me just write that down.
Yeah. Everyone good?
First question.
Yeah. So let's talk about this aid going to places, right? So 80% of aid is imported from Hodeidah. But if there's airstrikes everywhere else, doesn't that mean that the aid can't be distributed?
No, because there aren't that many airstrikes anymore.
Why?
They've
They're-
reduced by 95% because of U.S. leverage and because the Saudi Arabians
That's
just,
not true.
are pursuing them.
That's not true. Josh is going to indict that card. But what we would say... What?
I would say, like, even if you have like some airstrikes, I would say a lot of airstrikes are like hitting Houthi positions. Maybe some will hit a road or something, but aid is like being carried by like UN
No,
envoys
'cause
that
in-
aren't targeted by the Saudi airstrikes.
No, because in recent airstrike literally hit the road that carries 90% of the food.
Like, okay, we can look at that
Yeah,
later.
sure.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So, what's your link into like airstrikes ending?
We
So
say,
like U.S. arms deal stop, and how do airstrikes suddenly all vanish every
yeah, we say a couple of things. Things like spare parts, maintenance, logistical support. Like those are...
How is logistical support different from spare parts and maintenance?
Spare parts is a spare part, and logistics
What is
logistics.
what like logistics is a big word, and under that like big heading, there's like 2 subheadings.
What are you
Spare parts
talking-
and
wait,
maintenance, right?
wait, are you-
Logistics is just the front for those.
Alright, I'm going to Google what logistics means.
Yeah, well, you have to tell me what it is.
Like, because...
Like you can't just like I don't want to go
okay,
and like final
logistics-
focus and be like,
there's,
we
like-
respond to maintenance and
is this-
spare
are
parts,
these
but not
the-
logistics.
Are these the
You know?
3 things you're talking about? Like the 3 subheadings on Google? Like,
I don't know what your Google stuff is, man, but like how would you define logistics? I know what a spare part is.
Yeah.
It's a part that you need to repair. I know what maintenance is. It's like refueling, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what are logistics?
Like logistical support, you want me to read the definition? I can. So, logistical support is a detailed coordination of a complex operation involving
What?
many people.
That's the biggest definition. How does the U.S. do that? How does the U.S. actually accomplish that?
They help them with their planes.
So maintenance and spare parts are like something entirely different.
Well,
Is
obviously.
that like the U.S. calling up, the Saudi Arabian being like, hey, we're going to help you take off tomorrow by giving you a spare part? Like, what actually happens?
Well,
What's
yeah.
that's what happens? Okay, spare
Yeah.
parts maintenance? So
Spare part, no, and logistics.
No, you gotta do this.
There, like, no. Call for the definition. I'll show you.
The definition is as vague as it could possibly be.
No, I just read it to you. It's pretty there. It's like.
It's pretty there?
Yeah, the last one. Yeah.
It's not there at all. Alright, but can we talk about, like, spare parts first?
No, you just asked a question. I'm gonna ask you one.
Alright, we'll talk about it in a
So let's talk about this blockade, right? So your evidence is from 2018. What happened immediately after that?
Like, 2019?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the blockade was put back in place. So
Like, not really, man.
Yeah,
Like,
it was.
It was partially put back in place, but
no,
not
it was
entirely.
put back in place
All right,
over the
like,
port of
we
Hodeidah.
can
And
go-
Hodeidah has 80% of food, like you say. So that means
Is there a
the majority of-
ceasefire in Hodeidah right now?
Yeah, but it's been.
Is it
violated.
working?
Yeah, it's not.
It's not. Why not?
Because there's been violations.
Well, wait, what counts as a violation?
Like
And who said
bombings?
that
There was a bombing, like, 2 days
okay,
ago.
a bombing 2 days ago. Okay.
Yeah, that's
The
pretty
card
bad,
that you're
like, people
about
are
to
dying.
read- The card that you're about to read that says
All right,
it's
that's
like a thousand
time.
violations by the Saudi government.
Guys. Start prep now. Yeah. Alright, that was 20 seconds, so 29 taken.
Oh.
26 taken, sorry. Is everyone ready? Just down the case. Overview and then down the case.
One more.
Yeah.
Okay, now everyone ready? Alright. Starting now. Start with an overview. Their case effectively concedes our case because they say the United States has leverage over Saudi Arabia in the status quo. But the only reason why this would be true is if we had some control over being able to stop their airstrikes or their entire military. Otherwise, we have no leverage. So do not let them come up here and read in rebuttal that our military has no leverage and that they can continue bombings at the exact same rate. Specifically on their first argument, they have one really crappy link card that says Rogan says that U.S. has some leverage. No contextualization of why the voting for the negative side actually creates leverage in their role. But either way, we say this is bad for my opponents for a couple of reasons. First of all, we say there's no way that we use our arms sales as leverage in the status quo, because according to Time magazine in 2018, essentially there's a massive lobby in Congress that A, keeps the arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the defense industry, and B, because Saudi Arabia has massive oil reserves and they're able to lobby Congress either way, so that means the arms sales are going to continue. But number two, even if it did pass Congress, we say Donald Trump has said that he would veto basically any bill that's urged to end arms sales, so the United States is not going to use this leverage. But then second of all, we say the only way you can actually use leverage against Saudi Arabia is ending arms sales, because the way you cause reform to actually happen is you actually use your leverage, and in their role, they've never even cut arms sales a single time. The best way to stop your kids from playing Xbox is take away Xbox. And then third of all, we say that actually taking away arms sales would make Saudi Arabia acquiesce to the United States, because if they wanted to get their arms sales back, they would have to go and acquiesce. Moving on to their first argument on tightening the blockade, we would prerequisite this in two ways. First of all, you can't just send aid to Yemen for years and years and years and years. However, according to Oxfam in 2018, what's more important is the vast majority of these Yemenis are dependent on farming for their income. And when you bomb away all their farms, is what we tell you, they're not going to be able to get their income. They can't afford any food in the long term. But then second of all, according to the Maritime Executive, there's been a 50% decrease in imports into these Yemeni ports because of these airstrikes and this violence. Here's why this is important. They might tell you the United Nations wants to ship in these food, but these private commercial boats are never going to want to go into a port that is suffering from war. But then third of all, this is fake news that they took away the blockade, because according to The Guardian in 2018, they said that they would take away the blockade, but basically what happened was just tighten a lot of restrictions in some places, and they loosened restrictions in one or two places, and they said this is a removing of the blockade, which is why millions of people are still starving. Then on their second argument, they say the United States was able to pressure Saudi Arabia to go to a ceasefire. There is literally no reason why this would be true. They just say the United States said 4 times, please do a ceasefire. That doesn't mean that's the reason why they did the ceasefire. Rather, according to The Guardian 2018, their attack on Hodeidah became a complete stalemate. So rather than continuing fighting the stalemate, they conceded to a ceasefire to try to negotiate for the port, because they knew they were just spending billions of dollars on a war that was not working. But then second of all, we say these ceasefires are constantly failing. These ceasefires themselves tell you was broken according to PT News 100 times, and according to Al Jazeera as of last month, this ceasefire is on the verge of failure. Every single other ceasefire in the history of the Yemeni conflict, there were 6 in 2016, and they were all broken. They do not prove to you why these ceasefires are better. We say that having 1 month in a lull of fighting in their world is comparatively worse than in our world, because in our world we're able to have a long-term solvency. They're just having 1 month of peace every single time. And then third of all, we say these ceasefires aren't even a good thing, because according to Assad in 18, he said that they just used these ceasefires to rebuild their troops, which is why there's more violence afterward. But then second of all, according to Gistrati in 2018, if you constantly break ceasefires, that destroys trust from either side. That's why New York Times finds in 2018, even though the ceasefire is holding right now, after the ceasefire there's going to be even more violence, because no side trusts each other and they're so prepared for war right now, which means the failed ceasefires my opponents are advocating for are ultimately a bad thing. Then on their first argument on letting aid through, here's the issue. According to Reuters in February, even though there's 4 million people worth of aid, no one is able to access the aid because the Houthi troops are not letting them come in, and the Saudi Arabians are not negotiating well because they are not going to negotiate for any concessions. Their second impact is on violence, but we say the reason why there's a 164% increase in casualties is specifically because of airstrikes, because when you're airstriking a city with 250,000 people, that is why there's a 164,000 increase in casualties. And their third argument is on the peace progress. This evidence is awful. It's from November, and it says we are setting up an important way to cause peace. But according to the own guy that they cite in January, he literally said that this peace process is on the verge of failure because there's literally no progress being made. How do we create progress? That is by taking away power from Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, according to the Congressional Research Service, is basically advocating for an entire takeover of Houthi rebels, and they aren't making any concessions at the negotiating table. In order to have both sides on the same level, that is how you create negotiations. Thus, we urge you to vote for the negative side, or affirmative side.
Just before vote, I see the New York Times, there'll be even more violence after the ceasefire.
Yeah. I got it.
No, Okay. Oh, wait, actually, I'm gonna take a look.
Yeah. Actually, we have 135.
So, I'm going to be starting off on my case. First on their overview, and then I'm going to go to my second warning. Okay. No. So, are my opponents ready? Lives?
Yeah.
Judges? Start off in the overview. They tell you that we cannot advocate for leverage and still say that the fighting will continue. This isn't true for 3 reasons. One, because arms sales serve as a strategic alliance that makes Mohammed bin Salman seem like a reformer and has good relations with the West. Cutting off arms sales makes them look really bad, and that's why it's still leverage. But second of all, they get defensive weapons from the United States, even if they're not getting offensive weapons from the United States, like missile defense systems. They still want those things. But third, we concede that it will be a hassle in the long term for them to turn away from the United States. But even if they can wage war now, we tell you in the long term they will have to transition away from the U.S. That'll be really expensive in order to transition. But then go to our second point about the ceasefire. They tell you that the ceasefire is constantly failing and is on the verge of failure. This is just rhetoric, because Wintour tells you this month that there have been no large-scale invasion by the Saudi Arabians, that it's a Houthi-led city, and the most important thing is preventing the Saudis from invading it, from bombarding it with airstrikes. And he says that that the Saudis are not striking the port with airstrikes. And then even more so, Reuters tells you as of yesterday, the Houthis have agreed to withdraw from the city, and they're putting on a serious timetable of implementation. But even more so, tonight, the Washington Institute tells you 85% of the violations of the ceasefire occur in the boroughs south of the city, while the port is in the urban north of the city, and the urban violations are down by 90%, and that's why aid is flowing through. 22 million people are receiving aid. Doctors Without Borders built their first hospital in Hodeidah. The World Food Program is reaching a record amount of people, and the UN announced they are scaling up aid by 50% after the ceasefire. The ceasefire is working. Then, go to their case. Their thing is about Yemen, and they say that when we end, go to their capability link. They say we're going to end the capability to do airstrikes. This is not true. First, because the SFPRI said they've been stockpiling weapons for years to ensure continuity in their military intervention. They have the largest inventory of arms in the entire Gulf region. For that reason, NPR says they have largely stopped buying offensive weapons. They bought $112 billion of offensive weapons under Obama. They just bought $4 billion of weapons under Trump, but they're almost entirely defensive. That's why the Washington Institute tells you their inventory is enough to sustain the war for many years to come. That means they're not ending airstrikes on day one. But they tell you other ways they might end airstrikes. They say logistics doesn't mean anything. Let's go to what it actually could mean. First of all, it could mean spare parts, but Roche, or training, but Roche's Middle East Institute tells you to get all of that up front when they buy the weapons. Doesn't go away. Second, it could be like maintenance, but Brookings says there are 50 firms from all around the world bidding to maintain their air force. It's currently maintained by a British force, and there are domestic firms that can do it all on their own without the United States. No link there. It could be intelligence, but British MIU says that would continue after arms sales, and they have their own intelligence networks, and they don't need the United States. That means every single thing in their case can continue in their role as terminal defense on their case. Then, they tell you that Britain and France are going to stop selling them arms. This is not true. CNBC tells you they would likely continue to build their arms. And we, unlike them, give you historical precedent. In 2016, Obama tried to end precision guided munition sales. And right afterwards, Europe was able to fill the entire gap. And The Guardian tells you even more so that the UK, their largest European supplier, legally can't nullify their contracts even if they wanted to. That means all the maintenance and all the arms sales from Europe are going to continue. Then onto their warrants at the bottom of their case, we tell you you're going to change their behavior, you're going to negotiate. First of all, recognize that all this is reliant on them winning their capability argument. If they capability to maintain the war, they will continue to maintain the war. But even more so, we tell you that it's not that they tell you themselves that Congress passed a measure to end arms sales. This response to their thing when they say Congress will never use leverage because they are using the leverage. They just say Trump will veto it, but we tell you that Congress themselves can hold indefinitely arms sales from happening, which is at least with just a majority, not a 2/3 overriding the veto. So Congress still has leverage, and we tell you that leverage is being used, and that the key is to keep arms sales so we can use it as a bargaining chip. But even more so, they tell you that we shouldn't reward Saudi Arabia's behavior. But we tell you that Rogan tells you it's the opposite. As long as we can win that they are seeking peace right now, and they're doing ceasefires at least over important cities, we tell you it's the opposite of that because we pull out while they're seeking peace, and it makes it seem to them like peace is fruitless. But even more so, great admirers of Brookings Institute, the UAE, who we continue to arm, is even more active on the ground in the conflict. They actually conduct the majority of airstrikes. Our evidence is explicit about that. That means that the UAE will also continue the intervention, also continue airstrikes. The majority of airstrikes continue in their world. But even more so, we tell you that the Houthis will only gain more power and not seek the negotiating table. The Independent says even if the Saudis seek the negotiating table, the Houthis will not come to the negotiating table because they see the Saudi pullout as an opportunity to win the war. Save the ceasefire and the deal.
Okay. We will take some prep time starting now. That's 15 seconds, so 41 days.
Everybody ready for crossfire? Oh, also, can we see Roche?
It says if they all comes up front
Yes.
before.
Yeah. Arm sales, like all the, you get every single one.
Yeah,
spare.
yeah.
This card. I'll start time.
Okay.
That was 11 seconds. So, 50.
Okay.
So 53.
All right. Ready for cross?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, explain to me leverage on the con side. I don't really
Sure.
understand this argument.
So the idea is the United States sells Saudi Arabian arms. We get to say when we sell them arms as a military partner of them, we get to help dictate their policy. What that means is we can tell them, we would like you to not invade the Port of Odessa and agree to the ceasefire. They then say they don't want that. But then the United States has some leverage over them because we can say if we remove arms, if
Okay.
you do not do this, we will remove arms sales. When
Okay,
we take away
so-
our bargaining chip, they have no reason to listen to
All
us.
right,
We're not their military partner
So
anymore.
this is contingent on the idea that the United States has some risk of removing arms sales, right?
Not necessarily that they have some risk, but the Saudis that we think they have some risk.
Okay, so why would the Saudis believe that the United States has some risk insofar as number one, Donald Trump has said that he will veto any kind of bill.
Well, okay, so
Number two, there hasn't been a single part of Congress that has passed any bill about
there
arms
are
sales.
3 reasons why congressional leverage still matters. One, because as I read you in my rebuttal, Congress, even though Congress needs to override the president in order to pass the War Powers Act to totally end intervention.
The War Powers Act is not the same thing as arms sales.
I know it's not. That's
So,
not as good guess what
go back
Congress
to
can
arms
do.
sales, yeah.
So Congress, the congressional armed services, the Senate Armed Services Committee can indefinitely hold up an arms sale from happening
Okay,
until
they
they have a
can.
majority
They
of people on
can.
the panel.
My question for
That's something
you.
that
My
Saudi
question
Arabia
for
wouldn't
you.
want, 'cause it would
My
hold
question
arms
for you
sales
is when has this ever been used?
So like in March of last year,
On the
Menendez
War
held-
Powers Act?
No, not the War Powers Act. We're talking about holding up arms
So
sales.
you're telling me that the Congress has historically held up arms sales?
Yes, Menendez
Okay,
held
I'd
up
love
an
to see
arms
that
sale in
evidence.
March 2018, and it still has not gone through. And the
Okay.
Speaker of the Senate Democrats refused to let it through. But even more so, I was also going to tell you that even after they also care about their relationship with Congress in the long term. The point that Congress is pushing to end arms sales now, they understand that the Trump
Congress is not pushing to
gonna
end
allow-
arms sales now.
Well, they passed a bill.
They
to-
passed a bill that says end the American
Intervention.
military aid for the
the
military
Congress.
aid is not the same thing as selling because aid is you give them, sale is you buy.
Yes, but some of that aid includes the weapons that we sell them. But even if it's
No,
not,
because that's not selling,
so
then it's not
even
aid.
if it's not aid directly, we tell you that there
No,
is.
but there's a lot of reasons why
There is
selling is
recyc-
different from aid.
Okay, but no.
So first of all,
It
there's
doesn't
no
matter.
lobbying for
We're not
aid.
talking about that.
They're lobbying
we're talking
Congress
about
for
holding up
sales.
arms sales. We're talking about we're saying they can hold up individual arms sales
Okay, yeah.
from
So
happening. But
I'm
even
just
more-
saying that
and
your
I-
only example is aid, and then that's
But
just
even,
not.
but
what
and
it is.
they can also use the AECA in order to stop arms sales, and we tell you that that's important because even if Trump would veto that in the long term, they care about the relationship with Congress. The
Okay.
Trump administration won't last forever. They don't want to do things that will incentivize Congress to block arms sales in the long term.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can ask a question.
Sure. So you tell me there have been violations of the ceasefire. Where have those violations occurred?
Like you can say like 85% in like some
In the
areas.
rural South.
Yeah, but like, how about every other ceasefire in the past? Every single ceasefire has failed.
Well, we'll read you evidence in summary that says the reason this ceasefire uniquely is more likely to be effective is because because previous ceasefire tried to broker a deal over the entire country, whereas they're now taking it from the end of 2018 incremental
Okay.
approach, looking region by region.
That doesn't mean it's going to succeed because
Well, we tell
literally
you
your
it is
own
in
evidence that you
theory
cited me from November, that guy came out and said we've made no progress as of last
Like we've
week.
given
So
you empirical examples of the progress. 50% more people get aid.
no, that's during the ceasefire. We're saying the ceasefire is going to fail.
We're taking
Wait, you're taking?
Okay. You're taking.
We'll take prep starting now.
that was 44 seconds, and that means we took 97 seconds. So we have 23.
Oh, can we see the they held up an arm sale?
Sure. Damn, that was very cool.
The last one.
Is Bob Menendez the New Jersey senator?
Yeah.
And he was the election.
I'll start time now.
But that evidence is needed.
Okay. That was 4 seconds. So. Yeah. Alright, so it's going to start on their arguments and then it's going to return to mine. All three of my judges components. Josh. Alright. We tell you that leverage has never worked. You can look at all the 6 past peace deals have failed. They give you 3 reasons why it's going to work. But let's look at the comparison. Historically, it has failed because the United States leverage has never held up. What we tell you is that if you actually show that the United States is willing to use this leverage by affirming and taking away arms, in the future, we could put arms back, and that would actually be a positive show of leverage, which means it would force Saudi Arabia to negotiate. But on their first point, they dropped the Guardian evidence, which says that the blockade is still there, which means that food is still not going to enter unless you take away Saudi Arabia's bombing capacity. But specifically on their second one, they say a ceasefire is always here. But we tell you from the New York Times evidence that this ceasefire is doomed to fail. Their own guy literally comes out 2 months later and says it's going to fail. We tell you that when it fails, there's going to be more violence because Destrani tells you that when there's peace talk failures, both sides increasingly distrust each other and ramp up more weapons. But even more so, they don't respond to the OSIC evidence, which says that Houthis are just using the ceasefire to rebuild troops to launch another offensive. They just say that violations don't mean anything and there's going to be a withdrawal. We saw this withdrawal happen last month, but nothing really happened. But then on the violations issue, there's still 15% of violations, not in the rural side, but second, their evidence is specific to the Houthis. Saudi Arabia is still bombing this port, which is why the CFR evidence says that Saudi Arabia is not making concessions. The place where you vote for us is off our idea on airstrikes. What we tell you is that Saudi Arabian airstrikes are targeting critical infrastructure like agriculture and hospitals, which is why the Reuters evidence says that it's not about the ceasefire on Hodeidah, the stopping the starvation, it's about bombing, because remember, 60% of Yemenis rely on the agricultural sector for arms. They just say that there's going to be a stockpile of spare parts. Number one, they're not going to use their stockpiles of weapons because that would screw them over in the long term, but second, spare parts are not included in stockpiles because the United States holds them back. For example, in Indonesia, when we had an embargo on spare parts, they couldn't lift their fighter jets for a couple of years. They just say that it's included. We look at their evidence, it doesn't say that, it's just part of the arms deal. Finally, they just say that in 2016 we ended arms trade, but we tell you that was a short-term deal, but second, Obama just revamped bombing, which is why the Novak evidence says when you finally pull out, the UK will follow. They just say UAE has airstrikes, but what Bandar al-Qaeda finds is that 75% of civilian deaths and 70% infrastructure deaths are from Saudi Arabian airstrikes. Then they say that Houthis will aggress. Number one, Iran doesn't have military spending for that, and number two, UAE does a ground force war, which will always deter the Houthis from aggressing.
We're going
Just before this, can we just switch? Saudi 70%.
Yeah, sure. I have that.
Awesome. Thanks. donate 275.
All right. Is the pro ready? My choice. In both the app and night world, Saudi Arabia will have the same incentive and capacity to engage in the war in Yemen for 4 reasons. First, they have enormous stockpiles. They tell you they're not going to use these stockpiles. Not true. If they have an Iranian threat in their backyard, they want to get that out. That's their top priority. They will be using it. Now with the spare parts. Well, our evidence is very explicit here. It tells you that all the spare parts are given for the entire life cycle of the particular piece of equipment. On maintenance, there are 50 firms bidding for maintenance, and a UK firm is currently performing that maintenance. The UK government can't nullify that contract. Then we tell you that Europe filled in anything that the US stopped selling in 2016. Finally, on the UAE, our evidence is very explicit. It tells the UAE is conducting the majority of airstrikes. Now let's move to leverage. They tell you that we're never going to use our leverage. The House already passed a law that bans all arms to Saudi Arabia. It's moving on towards the Senate. The Saudis at least believe that we might pull out arms sales, and that's enough. We already started to pull them out before with that New Jersey senator. Then they tell you if we don't use our leverage, it's useless. That's completely wrong. If we do use our leverage, we don't have any more leverage. And it's good that we haven't been using it because it shows that Saudis have been listening to us, despite their enormous desire to attack the port of Hodeidah and deal a devastating blow to the rebels. That's because they do not want Iran on their border. The U.S. is the only thing holding them back. That's what Rogan of the McLaughlin Group explains. He tells you that the only reason they aren't attacking Hodeidah and dealing such a devastating blow is because U.S. arms sales function as the bargaining chip. Then they tell you that the ceasefire is falling apart and it's really bad. We tell you that there have been no major offensives, that the Houthis have agreed to withdraw this Thursday. Their evidence is really old, and there have been no airstrikes on the port, except like one in the first 48 hours of the ceasefire. And also, the few violations that are happening have occurred in the rural south of the city. In the northern part of the city, there's been a 90% reduction in hostilities. That's why there's been an increase in 50% more people are getting aid throughout all of Yemen because the UN has been able to get into this place. They tell you the ceasefire is just going to fail again. Not true. This ceasefire is qualitatively different than earlier ceasefires because we are engaging in a strategy of incrementalism. We aren't saying everyone needs to lay down arms all at once, all across the country. We're saying just we got to go city by city, lay down arms piece by piece. That's why it's been succeeding. That's why the Houthis are pulling out. What happens when we affirm the resolution? We remove that critical leverage, and Saudi Arabia again invades to deal a blow to the Houthi people. 14 million people are pushed into famine, and what we tell at the bottom of the case with the IRI and evidence is all negotiations are doomed forever because both sides see that the landmark ceasefire has failed. There's no way negotiations are going to work in the future. For these reasons, we urge a negating ballot.
Is everyone good?
Yeah.
Let's start China.
So how do you prove that pressure is the reason why they had a ceasefire?
Okay.
Because they really want to invade this port, right? Like the Saudi Arabians don't care how many civilians die in this assault. They just want to take back this port and deal with that.
Yeah, so, wait, let me respond. Here's the issue. What you don't respond to in summary is the idea that the reason why the ceasefire even happened is because the Hodeidah offensive was stopped. You tell me yourself in case that there was an offensive early in June, and this stalled out because there was a stalemate.
Our evidence is very, can I just
Yeah,
Our evidence is very explicit that it was because of U.S. pressure. In fact,
your evidence can be explicit, but
our
our warranting is still present.
No, let me explain why our evidence is better. Because our evidence literally says that the hours before they wanted to sign the ceasefire, they were not going to agree to it, and then Jim Mattis and Trump called the Saudi king MBS up and told him that there would be that there was a threat to end arms sales if he didn't do it, and it says specifically that was critical in convincing them from a no to a yes on the ceasefire. If you want to know whether the ceasefire is because of U.S. pressure, you should call for that.
We get next question. Yeah.
Sure.
All right. So let's talk about the idea that leverage is useless unless we use it, right? Yeah. So if we're not using our leverage, but we still kind of have them in a bind, doesn't that show that they might be listening to us? And that's a good thing?
Well,
this goes back to
that.
the previous
Okay,
question.
you just say like not using it has worked, but that doesn't mean that using it doesn't work either.
Well,
that's contingent upon you getting out of all the terminal.
What's the terminal? What do you mean? You yourself read me 3 reasons in rebuttal why cutting off arms sales right now would still be massive leverage.
Also, your impact is about the port of Hodeidah, and I also extend the Guardian evidence that says that there's still a blockade. So you're still not getting food in.
Okay.
We tell you it's a 50%
increase in aid. They're letting in UN ships.
Yeah, but that's not from Hodeidah.
Yeah,
that's because there was a small number of food coming in, and then they freed up a few ports, and now there's a little bit more.
It feeds 10 million people. That's not a small amount of food.
But there's comparatively more.
Wait, hold on. The 10 million? I thought
that's
based on 4 million. That's right.
Yeah, that's not
we read there are warehouses for 4 million.
Yeah.
The UN evidence says the 50% increase now allows for 10 million.
No. I have evidence that says that the the food is getting blocked off still because
Yeah.
But
That's the Reuters evidence, which
our-
you didn't
our-
respond to that.
Our
Yeah.
evidence is from this week, and it said the UN is scaling up and can now reach 10 million people.
You also just don't respond to the analysis that the UN just can't sustainably feed these people forever, right?
It's not
As
that
long as
we
there's
are-
still airstrikes,
Okay.
the Reuters evidence,
Well-
which you drop in summary, says that there's not going to be a sustainable solution to the conflict
Well,
and
our,
feeding them.
our analysis is that there's going to be a conflict in either world. You can't actually ground airstrikes. So the point that
Yeah, well, that's our case. Obviously, we win our case. We're winning this
but
round,
our
right?
point is that at the point that airstrikes do continue in either world, we say the most important thing is
Yes,
is
Ben,
that
if
one
you
of
win
the
our
people
case, you
who are
win, but, like,
dependent on humanitarian aid to survive to get that aid.
Okay. Like, yeah, if you win our case, then I guess we don't have offense, right there. Like, yeah, that's just a drawn out explanation.
I would
of it.
still say that like the amount of people killed in the entire conflict so far is about 17,000, and that's
That's
you
a
say
lot.
that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Sure. And how
Alright,
many people
alright.
killed in
Okay,
conflict?
and how?
Yeah.
They've also
I get
Relax,
it.
relax,
I
that's
agree.
time, that's
I agree.
time.
It's a lot, but like
We have 19
250,000
seconds, we're
died
gonna take it
the
now.
day it was assaulted.
That's all I've got.
Okay, is everyone ready?
Wait 1 second.
Just more time for me.
Okay, yeah, that's it.
Okay, is everyone ready now? Okay. I'm going to be starting on their case, first on leverage, and then on their second warrant, and then moving back to our case. Okay, starting now. Let's start on their case. First of all, on this idea of leverage, even if they do prove to you that in the negative world they're able to use negative leverage, that doesn't mean in the affirmative world where we actually take away arms sales from Saudi Arabia and tell them what they're doing is wrong, we don't have leverage. In fact, that is using our leverage, and we can use it as positive incentives. For example, if you behave better, then we'll give you the arms sales back. This is another way that the United States could use this time ending in arms sales, and then just don't make a contextualization why voting negative is the only way you can leverage Saudi Arabia. No offense in this round. In fact, we are the only side that has a legitimate use of actual leverage because we say ending all arms sales is better leverage than using like halting it for like a year. Then, second of all, let's talk about this idea of ceasefires. They say the ceasefire is different this time, and they cite this guy from November that says we're doing progression talks. However, that same guy came out in January and says we're a closing window of opportunity, nobody's making concessions, there is still no probability of ceasefire. And we see the reason why is because Saudi Arabia is too empowered. They have the United States in their backing, which means in their world, every single ceasefire in the past has never even worked a single time, which means we have no probability of actually solving this conflict. Let's go back to our case. Two reasons why we outweigh. First of all, they drop every single piece of weighing that I make in rebuttal. For example, the ports have a 50% decrease in imports because there's constant bombing there. For example, as long as Saudi Arabia is aggressive, there's no kind of negotiations that are actually going to be able to be working. All of these are dropped. So we say we outweigh on time frame because every single ceasefire that they talk about has just failed. We say having a long-term solution and decreasing the kind of airstrikes that have cut 75% of infrastructure is much more important. Let's go to why we do that. First of all, they say they get arms sales, they get spare parts straight up. No, that's not what their evidence says. These spare parts are controlled by the United States, which is why in Indonesia, for example, when we cut off spare parts, they were not able to go and fly. This evidence is phenomenal call for it. It's much more explicit than theirs. Second of all, they say that in 2016, Europe filled the gap. Europe doesn't make F-15s, means we're still able to do it. But then second of all, this is just one example. We say the pressure is a lot higher right now, which is why the NOAC evidence from 2018 that Druva extends says that right now if we cut off arms sales, they're going to stop. Then they say that the UAE is going to fill in. But the Druva response to this also that says 75% of the infrastructure conflict deaths and two-thirds of the humanitarian deaths are caused by Saudi Arabia because they are the ones that are targeting infrastructure. We outweigh their entire case. A, on probability. Nothing has actually happened in the negative world. Just one ceasefire that has failed every single time. B, we outweigh on time frame. One ceasefire that lasts 2 months. We say a constant decrease in the amount of conflict is definitely a better thing. We urge you to vote for the affirmative side.
Okay. Are my opponents ready? Judges, live.
Yeah.
Start at the top. They do not adequately address the terminal defense on their case. They say incentive and capacity to engage in war. We told you they stockpile weapons they continue to use. They don't contest that they will want to use a continual supply of weapons. Their only possible link into grounding the Saudi Air Force's spare parts. They just say our evidence is bad. Call for it. The Roche evidence explicitly says they get all the spare parts for the entire life cycle of the weapon up front. Indonesia is not a better example than our analysis, which is specific to Saudi Arabia. It says they get the spare parts up front. They do not need future investment. That operates, and it also says that Europe is the one maintaining their planes. It's not about about getting the planes, it's about maintaining them, and that's what they say, and we tell you they already have the planes, and Europe is the one maintaining them. That doesn't end, and we still have some conflicts in their world, because the UAE is still the majority of strikes, there's still the majority of ground operations. It's going to operate as terminal defense on their cases. The point that they cannot ground the Saudi Air Force, airstrikes are going to continue. In either world, your only decision is whether or not you want the U.S. to have leverage. Then they just say it's not, you can always have leverage. We tell you that's not how it works. If you do a bad thing, maybe you take it away from them. But at the point we're showing you that we're using our leverage to make them do a good thing, taking it away from them only makes them see that peace is fruitless because they are seeking peace and they're getting their arms cells taken away. That's why we say when you take away leverage, you don't have any leverage anymore. That's really crucial because Rogan tells you the only reason the U.S. signed the ceasefire, that they signed the ceasefire is because of U.S. pressure. They don't contest this in final focus. That means that in our world, you see the ceasefire succeed, and in their world, the ceasefire collapses. They just say the ceasefire is already collapsed. We tell you that's not true. Because the Guardian Amendment tells you there are no major offensives, and that the Houthis have agreed just yesterday to pull out in the next 3 days, and that not 85% of the violations are in the rural south of the city, whereas urban violations are down by 90%. As a result, we tell you aid is flowing through. There's been a 50% increase in UN aid coming through, and it's reaching 10 million people. Even if the food supply is somewhat diminished, we tell you there's still 10 million people reliant on this aid, and at that point, if you believe airstrikes continue around the world, you should have those 10 million people get it. They just say all ceasefires there. We tell you this ceasefire is qualitatively different because they're just regional. Instead of trying to get them to all the way down their arms, which is what their previous approach was. At the end of the day, we tell you remove the leverage. They invade Hodeida. 14 million people are burning starvation. You have 25 times more deaths in the entire conflict, and future negotiations are doomed to fail. We tell you the easiest way to vote in this round is a negative ballot.